Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. The Golden Axe series of games has been popular with us 30-somethings pretty much since the first one was released back in the 80s. Most people know it best from the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis if you're a sexy American or Canadian thick boy, but it was originally an arcade game. Buff fantasy characters packed with muscles, beards and cleavage riding on dragons was enough to lure in just about anyone back in the day, and thankfully the games were half decent too. As with anything mildly popular, it spawned a proper franchise and got a ton of ports to a bunch of systems. So here we're going to take a look at most of them, but not all of them. I don't have them all. Now, how about I shut the hell up, you press that subscribe button and we take a look at some games. We've got a ton to look at here, and I'm sure most of you knows these anyway, so I'll keep this brief.
That's my sidekick.
We are starting where it all began, in the arcades. This is of course Golden Axe, a fantasy themed beat 'em up. You can choose from one of 3 characters, each with their own motivation for killing the evil Death Equals Adder, who has been causing all sorts of mischief because he's a naughty boy. They also have their own moves and magic to help take out the hordes of enemies you'll be fighting. There's Axe Battler, the barbarian in blue, who, as we all know by now, doesn't actually use an axe, but goes around hacking people up with a sword instead. He uses earth magic, where rocks crash down on enemies from above. Mr. Battler is your all-round character. Next is Tyrus Flare, the red bikini-wearing Amazon warrior lady. She also has a sword, and although she's slightly weaker than Axe Battler, she does move faster, and her fire magic is the most powerful when it's at full power, with some awesome fire spells that absolutely ruin the enemies. And finally you have Gilius Thunderhead, a green-wearing dwarf who has a massive axe that does a ton of damage. Of course he is slower than the other characters, but his regular attacks are much more powerful. He uses lightning magic, but this isn't as powerful as the other 2. You play through a handful of levels as you make your way to Death Equals Adder's base, and you'll be fighting a ton of goons, from warriors to knights, skeletons and more. Enemies to come at you in groups, and they'll do their best to surround you at any opportunity. You really have to get used to keeping them all on one side of you, otherwise you're screwed. In terms of combat, it's pretty simple. You have one attack button that will do a combo, and depending on how close you are to an enemy, you do different slashes and throws. You can also run and do a dash attack, as well as a running jump attack that's really powerful but hard to hit enemies with. Enemies are tough too. They can easily kill you if you're not careful, and the bosses especially are hard and will often just ignore your attacks completely. This is an arcade game after all, and they need your coins. The graphics here are decent, and I still like the way it looks. The animation isn't great, but it's okay for the time, and my only real complaint is that everything looks a bit washed out. The sound and music here are great though. I really like the soundtrack here, and the sounds are all good. The game even uses sample from the Rambo movies for death screams. That's a fact that I learnt from GameSack, so thanks Joe. Overall, this is still a fun game to play, especially in 2 players. You can beat the whole thing in about 40 minutes, so why not do so? Now, this version got a lot of ports, so let's see how they compare. Get ready to see this first level a lot. We will start with the Mega Drive or Genesis version. This is by far the one that most people have played, and it's still included in every bloody compilation that Sega vomits up trying to get people to play fucking columns. Nobody wants to play columns, Sega. Anyway, this is a fantastic port that is about as close to the arcade as you could get on a home console at the time. Everything is here and it looks fantastic. I would actually say that other than some missing frames of animation and background effects, I do actually prefer the graphics here as they're darker and look a bit more detailed. All the characters are here, as well as the 2-player co-op mode. Something I didn't mention before, which is a pretty big thing about the games, are that there's a ton of different dragons or beasts you can ride. Beasts each have their own attacks. Some will tail whip, some breathe fire, some shoot fireballs, and some just like to headbutt stuff. Riding these are great, and they all look good and have some cool sound effects here. They've taken out the Rambo samples and replaced them with generic screams, but the music is still awesome and suits the game really well. Overall, this is a fantastic port that plays really well. Looks and sounds great and is really fun with a friend, or if you can't find a friend, maybe use Belt Buckle Bill. Not to be left out, the Master System also got a port. This has been stripped back a fair bit. You can only play as Axe Battler here, but to make up for it, you get to choose which of the magic sets you want to use, which is nice. It also means the game is single player only, which is a shame. Graphically, the game actually looks quite good, but mostly when it's not moving. The characters are large and detailed, though as you can see, the animation is incredibly choppy and everything looks very sped up. This is because all the graphics are actually animated background tiles and there's very few sprites on screen. This is how the game manages to play with no flicker, and while it is still quite playable, it really can't compare with the Mega Drive version and it's difficult to recommend it really. Technically this is quite impressive, but the jerky gameplay and weird speed of everything just don't do it for me. You might like it, but it's really not one I would say that you really need to bother with. The TurboGrafx CD got a version of Golden Axe. It starts off with a cool animated intro clearly showing off the power of the CD technology. It's fully voiced and everything, but all in Japanese. The character select screen shows a new anime style design for the characters, and they get their own intro scene to tell their story, which is basically all that they want to kill Death equals Adder. And by the way, that's how he's referred to in all of these games, Death equals Adder. And then you play the game, and I don't know what the hell happened here, but this is just a really bad playing, looking and sounding game in just about every area. The graphics are awful, the characters look terrible and are stiff to control, the animation is terrible and your character jerks about all over the place when you're attacking. Of course the hit detection isn't very good either, and your arms seem to just disconnect from your body when you're fighting. You'd think that with the CD technology the sound and music would be good, but it's really not. The music isn't terrible, but it sounds far worse than the arcade and Mega Drive versions somehow, and the sound effects here are just laughable with horrid shrill noises that will make your ears bleed, especially when using magic. The whole thing just seems so unfinished. Little things like using a dragon, but the fire coming out of its neck rather than its mouth just really take away from the experience. I'm guessing they spent all their money on the animated intro and forgot to bother programming the game. This one sucks, ignore it. The Wonderswan got a version of the game, and this is the first and only Wonderswan game that I've ever played. In case you don't know, the Wonderswan is a handheld console released by Bandai only in Japan. It didn't do so well, and you can kinda see why. Now this isn't a terrible port, but it is rough. It actually looks alright, and the colours are bright and colourful. The music here is well done, and the effects are okay, certainly better than the Turbo CD version. The controls are decent and responsive, if a little slow, but I never had any trouble pulling off my attacks, and the hit detection actually wasn't that bad for the most part. Overall, this isn't a bad port considering the hardware it's for. You can definitely have a bit of fun playing this one. Golden Axe for the motherfucking Amiga, shout out to Goobs at the Secret Levels podcast, is a closer port to the arcade version than the console ones. The game is pretty close to the arcade and has great visuals and gameplay that is fast and responsive. The controls can take a bit of getting used to, as most of the controllers for the system only have one button, so you might have to press up and attack at the same time to jump, but this actually works well enough. You'll need to be near the keyboard though in order to use your magic, which can be a pain having to let go of the controller with one hand, though this is common for most Amiga games, so most players will be used to it. The scenes between levels where you kick the crap out of little munchkin things to get more magic power have the little notice that the arcade did telling you to increase your power, and the game has most of the little background details that the arcade one does as well. I would say that this is the second best port of the game after the Mega Drive version, and it's well worth adding to the collection. It looks great, plays very well, and would be good fun in 2 players with its fast-paced action. Amazingly, the Commodore 64 also got a version of the game, and you know what? It's actually alright, all things considered. They have managed to keep all 3 characters playable, and as far as I can tell, every level in the game is also here, though you can only play in single player. They've had to cut back on the enemies here, and you'll only fight one at a time now, though they do still put up a challenge, but the combat is actually pretty good. Something they have had to change though is that now there's only one type of dragon for the whole game, which isn't really a problem, and only you can ride it. That means that if you get a hit while you're on the dragon, it just disappears and you lose it for good, whereas before if you're knocked off a dragon, that you usually have a chance to get back on it, or your enemies can get on it and ride it, but that doesn't happen here. The graphics are actually quite good for the C64, though the colours are a bit off, with my beloved Tyrus here being green rather than red, though I'm guessing that's all down to limitations. As it's the C64, you can only have sound or music, not both. But the sound here is fantastic, and honestly up there with some of my favourite versions. I love the SID sound chip and it does wonders for the already awesome soundtrack. The controls here are also very good. Like the Amiga one, you only have one button, so you need to press up and the attack button to jump, and I got this to work every time I needed it to. Once again, you do have to press a button on the keyboard to use your magic, but as there's only ever one enemy on screen, it's easy enough to do this without too much trouble. Though it does mean it always feels like a waste when I do use the magic, as it's only killing one enemy. Overall though, this is actually a very good port which really surprised me, and if you've got the C64, it is worth checking out. And finally for the ports, this is the Game Boy Advance version, which is available on the Sega Smash Pack, which comes with a couple of other games. And boy, this is probably the worst port I've played. I really don't get how the GBA is way more powerful than the Mega Drive, yet apparently this is the best they could be bothered to do. It is a port of the Mega Drive version, but everything is just worse. The graphics, to be fair, haven't changed too much, and everything has been brightened up to allow for the Game Boys that didn't have backlights, though I'm sure there is less animation here. Everything also seems to move faster, and you fly around the screen at high speeds. The sound and music are terrible, with high-pitched, crackly samples all over the place that just sound terrible. And the controls and hit detection, they never feel right. Sometimes it's hard to explain, but I was never confident that my attacks were going to connect. Of course, the enemies have no trouble hitting you though. Also, the jumping seems to be way less responsive, and I fell down almost every hole in the game, something I didn't even do on the C64 or Amiga versions. The main thing though is that the game is littered with bugs and glitches. Enemies would sometimes just get stuck on a frame of animation and not able to move until you hit them. They'd flicker in and out of visibility for no reason. And my favourite glitch, which luckily actually happened while I was recording, is that I fell off the screen at one point and died while there was two lady characters on screen. But instead of respawning, I just started to control one of the enemy characters, and then for some reason was playing as that character for the rest of the game, even when I died or used a continue. And for the bits between levels, the character just wouldn't appear at all. She would even change colour randomly as I played. I couldn't decide if this was a hidden bonus or a glitch, but let's face it, it wasn't meant to happen. This really is a shite version of the game. I didn't try the other games on the cart, but I'm guessing they have a similar level of shithousery in them, but I didn't want to find out, especially after hearing about the infamous Sonic GBA port. This is actually worth playing on an emulator, just to see what mad shit you can get it to do, but as a game, it's terrible. Right, that's enough of that. Golden Axe 2 came out for the Mega Drive in 1991 and is very much more of the same as the first one. Once again, you have the same three characters setting out to stop the evil Death Equals Adder. They've all had a slight upgrade in terms of looks, and I'm pretty sure my beloved Tyrus has had a boob job. In terms of gameplay, it's basically the same. You have the same attacks and magic, but everything does just feel more refined here. The controls are solid and responsive, and the hit detection is noticeably better here too, which makes the combat a lot more satisfying. You do get magic from books from sorcerers here, who actually attack you this time, though they aren't particularly tough. In fact, there's quite a few new enemies here, like lizard men and a ton more bosses, but get used to seeing them as most enemies are reused every few levels, which is a shame as it would have been nice to have new bosses on each level rather than the same one in a slightly different shade of brown and more hit points. They changed up the magic slightly here, and you can now hold down the magic button to charge it up, so you don't have to use all of your spells in one go, which is nice. As before, the music here is really good, and while I'd say it's not as good as the first game, it's still very enjoyable and suits it down to a T. I think this is a much more difficult game than the first one too, and definitely takes a lot more practice, but it just feels so much better to play, so you don't really mind, and you do get a few lives and continues, so we'll get that little bit further every time. It is very beatable, even with the annoying boss rush mode towards the end of the game. This is definitely the best Golden Axe game on the Mega Drive, so if for some reason you only want one of them, this would be the one to go for. The last Golden Axe game for the Mega Drive is the cunningly titled Golden Axe 3. Once again, this is an action beat 'em up where you have to go kick the crap out of a ton of dangerous enemies, ride dragons, and ultimately stop Death Equals Adder from being a bastard. And yes, I'll stop doing that now. This time round, Gilius is the only returning character from the other games, but he isn't even playable, which is a shame. He is in the game, but he's broken his leg, so he just appears at the start to say hello and set you on your way. You've got 4 new heroes to choose from. There's a giant called Proud Cragger, a Black Panther bloke called Kronos Rate, Kane Grinder is the sword bloke who's basically Axe Battler, and Sarah Byrne, who is basically Tyrus Flare. In fact, the last two are actually called Axe Battler and Tyrus Flare sometimes, depending on the version of the game that you're playing. The gameplay here is exactly what you'd expect, but there have been quite a few new additions to the combat in the form of special moves that can be performed with a specific button combination. This is a nice way to mix things up, though I did find a lot of the moves hard to pull off, so I just didn't bother most of the time. You also have a new block that you can do by pressing back and attack at the same time, but this takes a second or so to actually activate, so it's usually too late by the time you've tried to do it, so again, I just didn't really bother. The graphics here are decent and probably the best of the 3 games on the system. There's more enemies and bosses this time round, but you still end up fighting the same ones over and over, and bosses are reused a lot, which is a shame. There's a load of levels here, and the combat usually feels more solid and responsive than the other games, but somehow it also manages to not feel as good. I think this is partly down to the short range of most characters' attacks, and the much longer range of every enemy attack. Tyrus and Axe Battler, and yeah, I'm just going to call them that because that's really who they are fun to use, but they do feel a bit chody. The other 2 characters are just really not fun at all, and I stuck with the other 2. It was a real shame. Something else this game carries over from every other game in this series that really annoys me is that you can't change character at all during the game. Usually with games like this, when you continue, you can choose to swap characters, which is always welcome, but not in any of these Golden Axe games. The whole series forces you to make your choice and stick with it. I do usually like to mix it up, especially when you start playing as a crappy Panther bloke, but I'd rather swap out characters that continue rather than having to lose all my progress and reset the game. Overall though, this isn't a bad game. It's probably my least favourite of the original trilogy, and is actually the only one I've never managed to beat, though I'm not that fussed about doing that. However, it is worth a play every now and then if you've exhausted the other 2. Over to the arcade now for Golden Axe The Revenge of Death Adder, which as far as I'm aware has never had a console release, but it is available on one of those Sega plug-and-play system things. Once again, Death Adder is back, and you choose from 4 heroes to go stop his shenanigans. You have Stern the Barbarian, Dora the Centaur Lady, Goa the Giant, and Trix the useless farm boy elf thing. The characters here all actually feel quite good to use and have their own strengths and weaknesses. They're all massive too, which can be a problem, especially if you're Dora, who takes up a ton of the screen and can easily get her massive horse ass kicked. Interestingly, when you ride a creature with her though, she transforms into a human with 60 human legs. The only one I didn't really like playing as was Trix the elf thing though. He is very weak, but he does have quite a long attack range. Also, his magic is a bit crappy, and he just spawns apples that restore health, which admittedly is quite handy, but I'd rather have a screen clearing dragon. The gameplay here is as you'd expect, but everything has been turned up to 11. The graphics are awesome with some great character and monster designs. There's a load of enemies that all look good too, and they have a ton of animations and attack. Your characters have the basic moveset with just one attack button and a magic button. But again, you do a range of moves depending on your distance to the enemy. All of these look really good, and you can even stun enemies and more. The levels are all quite large and packed full of bad guys for you to take out. You'll often have 5 or 6 attacking you at the same time, and this can be really tough as you'll quickly get surrounded. Of course it would be easier with a second player, but that would involve having a friend. Throughout the levels you can find captured villagers to rescue, which is optional but a nice thing to do as you're a hero. You'll also find food and treasure that restores your health. Each character has their own magic, as in the previous games, and this game definitely has the best looking effects, which is no surprise. You also have the best music in the series here in my opinion, with some great tunes that sound like they should be in Conan the Barbarian movies. It is a pretty hard game, or it would be if you were playing on real hardware, as you have a tiny health bar and can easily be killed by regular enemies, and the bosses just need to hit you about 3 times for you to die, and they will. I get this is cheap arcade difficulty, but it does get frustrating how frequently you die. Thankfully though, you can finally change characters between continues here, so you do at least get to mix things up and keep it fresh every time you lose continue. What also helps is that the game introduces new enemies every few levels, though once again you will be fighting the same bosses over and over. To help with the replay value, you can also choose your route at regular intervals, so it won't be the same every time you play. This is easily my favourite Golden Axe game, even though I would have preferred to see the original cast here as playable characters, and yes I know Gilius is riding the giant so it's technically a character, but it's just not the same. Anyway, if you have the means to play this one, you really should, it's awesome. There are even a few spin-off titles in the Golden Axe series, starting with Golden Axe Warrior for the Sega Master System. In a nutshell, this is a not very subtle rip-off of Zelda, but in fairness, it does it extremely well. You play as Axe Battler, and you have to explore a large open world on a top-down perspective, fighting enemies and collecting items and weapons so you can access the 7 or so dungeons in the game, each of which contains a part of the Triforce, crystals that you need to defeat Ganon, Death Adder. So yeah, it's really not subtle in its inspiration, with graphics, enemies, levels and items all pretty much being carbon copies of the Zelda game for the NES, but it does work really well and it suits the Golden Axe universe. The game controls very well and your weapon has a decent range. You get swords and axes to use and they each have their own use. You can even use the axe to cut down bushes and open new areas or find some of the many hidden areas. These will include money or health power-ups that increase your life meter. Of course, later in the game you get magic too. The dungeons you enter have a few puzzle elements to them. You'll be pushing blocks, killing enemies and finding hidden switches in order to get through them, and you'll need to fight a boss, some of which are pretty damn tough. Finding the dungeons isn't easy though, and it took me ages just to find the first 3. There are people in towns that give you clues as to where they are, and these can be useful, but I did find that I was wandering about aimlessly quite a lot. Overall though, this is a really fun game, and dare I say it, I think I enjoy this more than I enjoy the Zelda game on the NES. It plays basically the same, but has better graphics and some nice little touches here and there. I would say this is a must-have for any Sega Master System collection. Axe Battler also starred in a game released only for the Game Gear called Axe Battler: A Legend of Golden Axe. You'll never believe it, but this actually plays a lot like Zelda 2 on the NES. The game is split between top-down exploration sections, and then when you meet an enemy, which you do randomly, it switches to a side view. Unfortunately though, unlike the Master System game, this one doesn't really do either of those things particularly well. The random battles happen way too frequently, and they really get in the way of exploring. And the actual combat is so clunky with pretty crap hit detection that it makes fighting enemies just a chore. Enemies you meet in random battles are always one-on-one fights, which are really frustrating to play as the enemies are usually faster than you with a longer range, and for some reason if you're hit just once the battle is over. I lost most of these fights, especially against skeletons. I have no idea how you're meant to fight them as they immediately jump at you and hit you, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it. You can find dungeons here which play like side-scrolling action games. These are slightly better, but not much, as again the hit detection is just bad, with your character's attacks going straight through most enemies most of the time, but of course they have no problem hitting you. This is a real shame, as the game looks alright and it's got good music, and generally I like these types of games, but after playing it for a while I don't think I'll ever go back to it. Oh, and don't ask why I decided to try the Japanese version, I have no idea. The Sega Saturn entry into the Golden Axe series is Golden Axe The Duel, and this came out at the height of Street Fighter popularity, so is a one-on-one fighter set in the Golden Axe universe, and surprisingly, it's actually a pretty good game. You get a decent selection of characters, though again, the original three don't make an appearance, apart from Gilius and Death Adder. The rest of the characters are either completely original or some tweaked enemies. The graphics here are great, with some excellent looking 2D sprites packed with animation. The controls are tight and responsive, and thankfully the special moves are all done using Street Fighter style inputs, and I never had a problem pulling off moves with the Saturn controller, which is basically made for fighting games. As you fight, you'll see these little munchkin men appear. If you hit them, they'll drop their magic, which you can collect. When you have enough, you can press all three punch buttons at the same time to use the magic power and power yourself up, where you'll do stronger attacks and take less damage. Of course, you've got to be careful though, as your opponents will also race to get the potions. I found that almost all the characters are fun to use, and they have good controls, which really helps. The fighting is fast and responsive, but also quite challenging, even on the easier difficulties. The CPU will block and counter a lot of your attacks, forcing you to at least try to have some strategy rather than just button mashing. Golden Axe The Duel really surprised me. I thought it was going to be a crappy half-assed fighter, but it's actually a solid game that I have in my actual collection, and I do come back to it quite often. Interestingly, the original Golden Axe got a remake on the PlayStation 2 as part of Sega's Simple series, which is a line of budget releases that are at a low price, where remakes of classic games like Golden Axe, Fantasy Zone, Outrun and more were the order of the day. So this is a remake of Golden Axe from the ground up in full 3D. You have the original three characters as well as all the enemies and dragons you know from the games before. The levels are all here, but they have been massively extended and now take ages to get through, and you even get cutscenes here and there. Graphics wise, the game looks okay. It is pretty basic, but that's kind of the point with these simple series of games. But it doesn't look bad, just a bit cheap. The animation is a bit funny in spots, but it does the job. I have to say though, I do really like the magic effects, even if they are a bit cheesy. What's important though is the gameplay, and really it is not bad here. I hear a lot of people complain about this game, but the controls are responsive and everything moves at a good pace, and thankfully the hit detection is actually pretty damn good. There's a few nice additions in here, like the cutscenes I mentioned, but you also get a life bar for every enemy, which is always welcome. Unfortunately, they still haven't added the ability to change character between continues, which is a shame, and it would have been nice to have a few more enemy types included. Yes, they did use the ones from the original games, but that means there's about 5 enemies in just a few different shades of green. It would have been nice to see new ones added every few levels. And really that's it. It's a very simple remake of the first game that is perfectly playable, and I actually enjoyed going through this one. It would be great with a second player too. If you go into it expecting an awesome remake, then you are going to be disappointed. But if you go into it looking at it for what it is, a deliberately cheap remake, then you're likely to have a bit of a good time, as it is a solid playing game that will entertain you for a couple of hours. And finally for today, Jesus, you must be sick of my voice by now. Here is Golden Axe Beast Rider, released for the Xbox 360 and PS3. Yeah, Death Adder is back, and this time the whole story revolves around Tyrus Flare, whose dragon god has been kidnapped and enslaved by Death Adder, so they can use its power to take over the world. So you play as Tyrus for the whole game and set out to stop him. This is a third-person action game that is all about combat, and you know what? Despite what people will try and make you believe, this is actually a pretty fun game that isn't perfect, but I did enjoy playing through it. You go through a few different lands, from forests to deserts, swamps, and even the land of the dead. Each world is split into small sections, and a bunch of enemies will spawn in, and the game almost plays like a time trial game, as you're ranked on your speed and fighting ability. The higher your rank at the end of the level, the more treasure you get, and the more treasure you have unlocks more weapons and outfits. You can also replay any of the levels at any time as well. The game is very linear in story mode, and some levels are larger than others and require a bit of exploration to find switches, etc. to open gates, but that's about as complex as it gets. The actual combat is pretty damn basic too. You've got a weak attack and a strong attack. You can hammer the button to do basic combos, and a mixture of the two does different combos. Timing also comes into it quite a lot. So if you press an attack button, but then wait a second or so before pressing it again, you actually do a different, usually more powerful attack. It's kind of hard to explain, but it does work well when you're doing it. The biggest issue though with the combat is that this is one of those games where you have to wait for all your animations to finish before you can do anything else, including blocking, which is a big part of the combat. You've got two block buttons, a block and a parry. Depending on the attack the enemy does, a certain colour will flash. If they flash blue, you press the block button. If they flash orange, you press the parry button. If you do this correctly, you'll dodge the attack and stagger the enemy, and your next attack will be more powerful. Or if you use the correct attack after blocking or parrying, you actually do an instant kill move on some of the weaker enemies that will also often kill other enemies around you as well. This is actually pretty cool, and I think it works well, but I've heard a lot of people complain about it being confusing, which it really isn't. If it's blue, you block, if it's orange, you parry. It's simple, and it works the same way as blocking and reversing does in most wrestling games. It actually really reminded me of No Mercy on the N64, so if you're used to that game, you should be fine with this one. The graphics here are very good, as pretty much all Sega games are really. There's a lot of detail everywhere, and the character models are all pretty decent. As the title of the game suggests, there's also a load of beasts for you to ride, though funnily enough, this is often the worst parts of the game as the beasts don't actually control that well. This is again down to the fact that all the animations have to finish before you can do anything else, so if you miss with an attack, you'll be left wide open for enemies to get you. The beasts do all look good, and some are massive hulking brutes that can mess up enemies very quickly, but you've got to be careful, as if you're knocked off them, the enemies can then use them against you. The game is definitely best played in short bursts though, and it really is the same thing over and over. Basically, go to an area, kill 100 enemies, and repeat. I'll be honest, I was expecting more of a story-based game, which this really isn't. It is best seen as more of a wave attack game. But technically, this is probably my favourite Golden Axe game for one good reason, and that's what I'll leave you with here. So there you go, almost every version of Golden Axe out there. Which one is your favourite? It really is a shame that we haven't had a new game in this series, and let's face it, we probably never will. A God of War style game would be incredible and would totally suit this universe, but yeah, it ain't gonna happen. On screen now you can see where you can follow us, so why not do so? We've got a ton of cool content for everyone to enjoy. Now all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.